This morning, I'd like to give you an overview of his life and career, but in particular, I'll be focusing on his remarkable experience in Warsaw just after the First World War. I thought you'd enjoy hearing a bit about how an American came about. It has been said that timing is everything, and I would add that serendipity creates the timing and the opportunity. That's most certainly true of Hugh Gibson's story and of my own in relation to his. What began as a master's thesis on the diplomatic effects of Herbert Hoover's 1946 Famine Relief Survey, that's a mouthful, ended up telling the story of Hugh Gibson in Poland. There were a lot of interesting rabbit holes along the way, but looking back, the path was clear. Let me explain a little bit. So the background of both an American in Warsaw and the 1946 famine relief trip dates back to the summer of 1914. Gibson arrived in Belgium to be the secretary of the legation just weeks before World War I began. By September, Belgians faced starvation during the coming winter under the harsh German occupation. That one was supposed to go on already. Okay, I caught up. Making their way across enemy lines, Gibson accompanied a group of Belgians to London to seek assistance. Hoover was approached. With much thought but little hesitation, Hoover put aside his mining business and took up the task of feeding the Belgians. This launched his public service career and a lifetime of friendship and humanitarian work with Hugh Gibson. So if we fast forward from 1914 to 1946, the world was just emerging from the devastating Second World War, and famine threatened many areas. At the behest of President Truman, Hoover established the Famine Emergency Committee. Where did I go here? Hoover, with Gibson as his diplomatic liaison and a team of experts, set out in March 1946 to survey the world's post-war food needs. They visited 34 countries in a 3-month interval. At each stop, the mission was the same: assess the needs, find surpluses, and clear the shipping channels to move all available foodstuffs to the areas most at risk. As I was soon to learn, the working relationships and experience of the FEC dated back to 1914. Most of these men had worked together since World War I days, and now stepped up to help once more. 2 of them really stand out. Maurice Pate, who was soon to take up the reins of UNICEF, focused on the specific needs of children. Frank Mason, who served as the vice president of NBC from 1931 to 45, handled all the public relations. Hugh Gibson kept the best diary of this whirlwind trip, which virtually encapsulates 20th century history. He's a great storyteller, and as I researched, I learned to trust Gibson's judgment. Almost always, he nailed the personalities and situations spot on. Serendipity struck when I connected with Gibson's son, Michael Francis Gibson, in 2010. Michael was a fascinating man in his own right. He took me under his wing and taught me an incredible amount about his father's world. He offered the context I needed to understand that diary and so much more. When Hoover and Gibson arrived in Warsaw on March 31st, 1946, Gibson expressed a more raw emotion than he had in other war-devastated areas. Of course, I questioned Michael about this, and the answer stunned me. As it turned out, Gibson had lived among the Poles during the first 5 years of their modern existence as a nation, as the first U.S. minister to Poland from 1919 to 24. Because of my own Polish heritage, Poland now had my full attention, and an American in Warsaw was born. The magic of timing took over again when I realized we were approaching the centenary of the events Gibson recorded. And did he ever keep records? The Hoover Institution Archives, located on Stanford University's campus, holds 181 containers of Gibson's records. More remain with the Gibson family in Paris. In 2013, I spent 10 wonderful days there and was granted access to all the materials. The rich record left by Hugh Gibson includes detailed diplomatic reports and an enviable correspondence with many of the major lights of his day. One of the most unique collections of letters was always intended to be kept as his diary. This is a good moment to introduce Hugh Gibson himself. Gibson's background was exceptional, at least by the measure of most turn-of-the-century American diplomats, many of whom were the sons of the wealthy elite, leading to allegations that the top diplomatic posts belong only to a small club of gentlemen. Gibson did not fit that mold, but nevertheless, he flourished and took his place among them. Hugh's parents, Frank and Mary Gibson of Los Angeles, hailed from pioneers, missionaries, and Indian affair advocates. When Hugh was born in 1883, Frank was a local bank manager and Mary a teacher. They'd lost 3 of their 4 children to various childhood diseases. At age 4, Hugh survived a bout of polio that left him in frail health. Frank and Mary fought the dreaded disease by putting little Hugh on a horse for an hour every day. Mary educated Hugh herself for the most part, preparing him to attend Los Angeles Military Academy and Pomona College, all before he turned 18. Sadly, at that point, Frank died. Mary sold their home to finance the completion of Hugh's education in Europe. As they traveled, Hugh became fluent in French and developed a love of diplomacy. He was one of the first Americans to graduate from Paris's prestigious Sciences Po in 1907. From the day he passed the Foreign Service exams with flying colors in 1908, Gibson's career was on an adventurous path, and he recorded his adventures by writing to Mary faithfully every day from then until her death in 1930. She saved the letters, forming the diary that chronicled Hugh's eventful career. For starters, he was promptly sent mule packing to the remote legation in Tegucigalpa. Then he was mugged in a Havana restaurant by a Cuban journalist protesting U.S. policy in 1912. And then he arrived in Belgium just in time to witness the German advance into Brussels in 1914. As mentioned earlier, the suffering of the Belgians led Gibson into lifelong collaboration with Herbert Hoover. At the same time, it introduced him to a feisty young Belgian woman named Inez Reintjens, later to become his wife. Oops. Hang on one second. I'll go back to that one. By the time the U.S. entered the war in April of 1917, Hoover's responsibility had grown to overseeing all the food issues for the Allies. Immediately upon conclusion of the war, Hoover was in charge of the American Relief Administration, which fed much of Europe for the next year and beyond. As for Gibson, after working from London and Washington, he was assigned to Paris in 1918 as Secretary of the Embassy. Well, I don't know about you, but that didn't sound very impressive to me. But in reality, it was just a cover. During the years since the U.S. had entered the war in Europe, problems had sprung up in almost every sector: military, propaganda, espionage, and new national movements. Gibson was sent by the State Department as a kind of fixer, authorized to assess and act on almost any issue. Although he officially outranked even the ambassadors, he requested the title of secretary to avoid unnecessary conflict. He preferred the freedom to act to the prestige of a title. Gibson's assignments included advising General John Pershing and General Dennis Nolan, who was Chief of Military Intelligence. He was tasked with coordinating the fragmented and divergent propaganda efforts. In addition, he was assigned to monitor the development of both the Polish and the Czech national movements and be the official liaison between them and the United States. All of this offered a sweeping understanding of European affairs by Armistice Day, November 11, 1918. So although Gibson was one of the younger diplomats, it's not surprising that he was chosen by President Wilson to be the first U.S. minister to the reconstituted nation in April 1919, nation of Poland. So there was my next sticking point. So what does that even mean, the reconstituted nation of Poland? So I'll try to sum up 1,000 years of Polish history in only like 5 sentences, so you can, so you can have some idea of the world GIBSON was stepping into. Poland's history dates back to about 966 AD, but despite centuries of admirable achievements, great military prowess, and precocious experiments in democratic government, Poland entered into a slow decline in the 18th century, having failed to build a strong, centralized state. Although Polish patriots fought on behalf of revolutionary America, Poland failed to implement its own new constitution and was gradually dismembered by the empires of Germany, Russia, and Austria. By 1795, an independent Poland no longer existed, and this unfortunate situation endured until the disintegration of those empires, coinciding with the end of the First World War. So the problems facing the Poles in trying to reestablish their nation in 1918 was staggering. For starters, Polish territory faced the same deprivations as all war-torn areas, but without a strong centralized government to address the problems. Agriculture was destroyed, industry dysfunctional even if supplies could be found, and most critically, food and medicine were in desperately short supply. For Poland, the complications were even more severe in 3 specific ways. First, Polish leadership was divided between the military, which had gained control in Warsaw, and the representatives in Paris, who negotiated for an independent Poland. The military hero, Pilsudski, was a frightening unknown to the Allied peace commissioners. Dmowski, the Polish representative in Paris, was known. However, his extreme Polish nationalism and flagrant anti-Semitism worked against him. In a backroom surprise compromise, the world-renowned pianist Paderewski stepped forward to lead the first Polish government. Having been active in relief efforts from America and an early supporter of the Polish national movement, he sacrificed his musical career to take on the task of statesmanship. In the process, he and GIBSON formed a close friendship. The second problem Poland faced was that of borders. In their great wisdom, the commissioners in Paris left all of Poland's many borders undefined and unsecured. Border conflicts on many fronts began before the ink was dry. The biggest conflict of all was the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 21. So while there was peace in Western Europe on November 11, 1918, there was no peace in Poland for 3 more years. The third problem, which had to be addressed before the new nation could function adequately and before humanitarian relief could really be effective, was how the vestiges of these 3 empires could be melded into one new system. Just for one example, take railroads. So all railroad gauges are meant to work together, right? Well, not in Poland. All 3 empires use different track gauges. This created impossible situations. GIBSON watched as desperately needed potatoes were carried by hand the several yards between the cars of one railway and the waiting cars of another. The legal system, banking structures, currency, languages, education, and so forth all faced the same kinds of messes. In addition to variant gauges, railroads required coal to run. Here again lay trouble. The ownership of the most developed and productive coal fields in Central Europe was contested by Poland, Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. Production was greatly reduced after the war, and miners' strikes were common. Border skirmishes constantly nudged the nations toward a new war. On top of all this, a new epidemic hit Poland in 1919, typhus. Refugees from the east fleeing Bolshevik advances flooded into Polish territory. Conditions were terrible and made more so by vermin. Typhus infected over 430,000 persons, most of whom died. So this was the situation that faced Poland in April 1919, when 36-year-old GIBSON approached Warsaw. Although his eyes were wide open, though, he found Warsaw beautiful. The Poles, in turn, were delighted with GIBSON. With his usual grandiloquence, Paderewski announced, quote, "Not only did GIBSON show himself a man of exceptional experience, of unusual talent, of an enthusiasm rarely found in a diplomat, and of sane and sound judgment. But Warsaw quickly discovered in him a charm and attractiveness of personality that immediately made him most popular with all who had anything to do with him. And as for the Americans, they swore by him. And that is Paderewski in a paragraph. Not surprisingly, finding accommodations for the legation and its employees in Warsaw was difficult. The Bristol Hotel became the base of U.S. presence in Warsaw until summer. Because coal was scarce, so was heat. Gibson complained, quote, "It was colder than the inside of a fish, and I spent the morning walking up and down in my drawing room, dictating in my heavy coat," end quote. Okay. Gibson had the honor to be on hand for the celebration of the first Polish National Day on May 3rd, 1919. Several original photographs were found in the collection in Paris and made their way into the book. Polish names presented another unfathomable problem. Early on, Gibson wrote, quote, "The names of these people are our despair. I've only met a few at a time, so I grip each name firmly and pray for the strength to remember it until I meet him next time." Humor aside, Gibson provided the State Department with regular and detailed reports on the state of Polish affairs. At times, Gibson tried to educate his superiors in Washington by delving into the history behind Polish problems. He became quite caustic with the Poles in the later years of his tenure as he grew increasingly exasperated with the sometimes inscrutable attitude of his bureaucratic counterparts. American relief efforts were already in full swing when Gibson arrived in Warsaw, led by William Grove and Hoover's ARA. Also hard at work were the Red Cross and the American Joint Jewish Distribution Committee, headed by Boris Bogan. Lutherans, Quakers, and the YMCA were also active. At Hoover's insistence, all groups worked together under the banner of the ARA, minimizing duplication and waste. While Gibson maintained regular contact with the leaders of these bands of American heroes, several issues with international implications required his utmost diplomatic skill. As mentioned earlier, the typhus epidemic was severe. In June 1919, General Pershing assigned Harry Gilchrist to lead the efforts, which incorporated many of the agencies already at work in Poland. Unfortunately, the Polish government was slow to follow Gilchrist's directions. It was only after Gibson's intervention that all Polish ministries were directed to follow Gilchrist's orders. These were draconian, but simple and necessary. The Polish Minister of Health removed the obstacles, and gradually the epidemic was brought under control. Coal was another issue that consumed Gibson's time. Undetermined borders left the critical coal fields open to dispute. Often, the disputes turned violent. Poles attacked Germans, Germans attacked Poles, Poles took hostages, Germans threatened to kill 2 Poles for every German taken, and so on and so on and so on. Hoover and the Supreme Economic Council in Paris sent Anson Goodyear into the fray. Although he had little real authority, with sheer personal integrity and a lot of bluff, Gibson managed to wring concession and concession from the Germans. Gibson's help was required to bring the Poles into line. Ultimately, by August 1919, 300 German prisoners were released from Polish custody. The Germans lifted their sanctions, and all-out war was averted. Demanding the lion's share of Gibson's attention and diplomatic skill during his first year in Warsaw was the Jewish question. When Poland was carved from the German, Austrian, and Russian empires, her borders suddenly included Europe's densest concentration of Jewish citizens. Having experienced Russian pogroms for centuries, these Jews hoped for sweeping new rights and safeguards from the new nation. In a setting of war deprivation and mass chaos, incidents of violence broke out. In the Western press, incidents of violence against Jews dominated the headlines. The Polish government made every attempt to quell accusations of anti-Semitism, but these fell short of reassuring the worried West. American Jews demanded investigation into the matter, and it initially fell to GIBSON to ferret the truth out of a complex and contentious situation. GIBSON's legation, short-staffed and still housed in the Bristol Hotel, was flooded with telegrams from Washington. The outcry in America was reaching a fever pitch, with shocking headlines every day. Representatives of all stripes demanded action. It became GIBSON's #1 priority to sort truth from fiction and prepare for the impending official investigation by Henry Morgenthau. To do this, GIBSON paired up with Boris Bogan of the JDC. Together, they toured several towns where pogroms had been reported. They visited villages, synagogues, and homes. They interviewed individuals privately so that the persecuted could speak freely. What Bogan and GIBSON heard didn't surprise them. They were welcomed into the home of a rabbi who narrated a story of starving people, clashing armies with no orders and no supplies, and a general atmosphere of fear and desperation. Food was scarce, merchants hoarded, prices were sky high, basically chaos was everywhere. What Bogan and GIBSON did not hear were stories and numbers that jived with the Western headlines. They spent time with persons listed as deceased. They asked the experience of detainees, hearing stories of inconvenience, injury, and fear. Some stories, of course, were outright tragedies. However, the numbers of reported victims were much higher in the Western press than they were in the local communities, and often included non-Jews as well as Jews. There were cases where all the food shops in the village were ransacked and shopkeepers terrorized, regardless of creed. Yes, GIBSON did found cases of outrages against Jews in Poland, but he also found that reports had been exaggerated in the Western press. Just outside of one of the towns, named Lida, GIBSON and Bogan stopped at an orphanage. GIBSON saw some sights I shan't forget, quote, "The hospital ward was dark and the windows tight closed. Most of the children had fever and none had had their bandages changed for days. In addition, they had no milk and very little food of any sort. They brought me a piece of the bread they make on the premises. It was vile, smelled sour and musty, and was heavy as lead. At that, it was much better than what they could buy in town. The awful thing is that this is just one of hundreds of similar situations throughout the country. I don't see anything for it," said GIBSON, "but to get large numbers of nurses and trained welfare workers in and park them throughout the country to look after just such places and make the needs known." Into just these kinds of situations, the Gray Samaritans entered. About 30 girls of Polish-American heritage, age only 19 to 22, were trained to teach nutrition, hygiene, and childcare. They arrived in the summer of 1919 and were dispersed individually or only in twos to scattered villages and into situations like Lida. They toiled in isolated and desperate surroundings throughout the Bolshevik advance during the Polish-Soviet War. The courage of these young women is stunning and virtually forgotten. Upon GIBSON's return from his fact-finding mission, he was called to Paris to deliver his report to the American Peace Commissioners. As word got out that he was in town, GIBSON was approached by Louis Brandeis and Felix Frankfurter, who were in Paris as Zionist representatives of the American Jewish Congress. They were not pleased with GIBSON's report. In fact, they were much upset by Louis Marshall's statement in the New York Times on June 10th. GIBSON records, quote, "These two opened the prosecution by saying that I had done more mischief to the Jewish race than anyone who had lived in the last century." I made it very plain to them that if they were anxious to stir up bad feelings and maintain agitation for its own sake, it was right to go ahead with just this sort of scurrilous attack. If, on the other hand, they wanted to ameliorate the condition of the Jews in Poland, it was foolish to try to undermine public confidence in the integrity and fairness of governmental officials who were trying to help. I think they took away something to ponder. Although no retraction of their words or apology to GIBSON was ever made, GIBSON won them over one by one. Exactly 1 year later, in June 1920, GIBSON was invited to speak at a JDC event in New York. To Mary, Hugh wrote, quote, "It would have amused you to hear the praises of your son from the same men who were trying with all their strength to skin him alive last year. The same Lewis Marshall who was denouncing me in the New York papers made a speech which was fit to be engraved on my tombstone. That is, if I had a few acres of tombstone. The others followed in the same strain. Anyway, it got them on record." So while all of this is important and interesting historical information, An American in Warsaw is not just a chronicle of American aid to Poland or GIBSON's equitable handling of delicate diplomatic questions. It's also a record of the information GIBSON sent flooding back to Washington. The Polish government responded to GIBSON's nudgings, at least some of the leaders some of the time. Sadly, the Polish leader GIBSON was most connected to was Paderewski. He was outmaneuvered and driven from office by the end of 1919. On the other hand, Pilsudski quickly developed a liking for GIBSON, and he both considered GIBSON's advice and offered insights into his own thinking, helping the U.S. understand. So at this point, a bit needs to be explained about the Polish-Soviet War. Russia had just undergone a bloody revolution that toppled the Tsarist Empire in 1917. Before the Treaty of Versailles was signed, the lands now comprising eastern Poland belonged to Russia. The ruling Bolshevik Party plainly stated their desire to export their revolution to the rest of the world. A Russian invasion of Poland was somewhat inevitable at that time. As World War I faded and the Polish-Soviet War impended, a talented and brave group of American pilots volunteered to fly for the Polish Army and help build up a Polish Air Force. The KOSCIUSKO Squadron was very active on behalf of Poland during 1920. Their feats are legendary. Their indomitable leader, Marion Cooper, became another lifelong friend of GIBSON's. Cooper went on to produce the first King Kong movie and founded Pan Am Airlines. When war returned to Europe in 1939, Cooper was instrumental in training and supporting the new KOSCIUSKO Squadron No. 303, operating from Britain. His path and GIBSON's crossed again in London when both men continued their work on behalf of the Poles. As it turned out, GIBSON was not in Poland during the fateful summer of 1920 when the Bolsheviks neared Warsaw. This fact alone has discouraged many scholars from seeking his perspective. However, my opinion was changed when I discovered what he was doing during that time. Believing that a personal presentation of the Polish situation would encourage the U.S. to offer both aid and guidance to Poland, GIBSON went to Washington. During that time, he was offered the post of Assistant Secretary of State. Despite considerable pressure to accept, he declined the offer, believing he could be of more use on the ground in Warsaw. When the Bolshevik army approached the Polish capital in August and things looked their bleakest, GIBSON dropped everything and rushed back across the Atlantic. He reached France to be greeted with the news of Pilsudski's miracle on the Vistula on August 25th and Poland's survival. Against all odds, the Poles kept going. That is not to say that everything went smoothly after that point. In fact, almost nothing did. The Polish economy was in shambles and experiencing drastic inflation. Crops were again compromised due to the most recent fighting, increasing the risk of famine and need of outside assistance. Although much effort was spent on these pressing matters, the Polish political system remained cumbersome and incompetent. For GIBSON and for Poland, 1922 was a starting point. In February, Gibson set off for Brussels with his naval attaché, Hugo Kohler. This was a really big rabbit hole because you can hear, instead of naval attaché, intelligence officer, and really good spy story. The purpose of the trip was the wedding of the decade. Hugh and Inez married in February 1922. Sadly, tragedy struck before the year was out. The Gibsons' first child was stillborn on November 26th. This was immediately followed by Poland's tragedy. On December 10th, Poland celebrated the completion of their first presidential elections. Gabriel Narutowicz, the minority candidate, won because both the right and the left were factionalized and dysfunctional. The presidency of Narutowicz, however, lasted only 6 days. He was struck down by an assassin's bullet. Gibson duly reported the assassination and the political upheaval in his weekly reports, making for some pretty grim reading. But his letters, detailing the murder of his dear friend, breaks one's heart. A firm believer in democratic ideals, Gibson valued honesty and efficiency far above race and social status or political protocols. He expected both his fellow Americans and Polish counterparts to comport themselves with scrupulous decency, and he grumbled equally when he was disappointed. Gibson worked to support the Polish state during his tenure in Warsaw, which ended in 1924 with his appointment as minister to Switzerland. Subsequently, Gibson served as ambassador to Belgium twice, as well as to Brazil. He earned 2 doctoral degrees. He represented the United States at disarmament conferences and mediated at the Chaco peace talks in South America. However, in 1938, Gibson chose to retire rather than accept President Roosevelt's assignment to Berlin. Instead, he volunteered to lead the European operations for the Commission for Polish Relief, designed by Hoover to address the needs of a Poland again under assault. For the next 2 years, Gibson struggled to negotiate with Berlin, bypass the British blockade, get Polish gold out of Romania, and bring relief to the again suffering Poles. This might be an upcoming story. This slide has been slow to come up, so it'll come up eventually. On the last day of his life, in December of 1954, Gibson was still working to bring relief to the suffering. With his leg in a cast from a fall sustained while suffering from shingles, he attended an important meeting in Geneva, and you can see the title of the group there, but it's a mouthful. Basically, his job was to monitor the movements of displaced persons throughout Europe and beyond. This was another epiphany moment for me, because my mother and her family were displaced persons making their way to Los Angeles. As I worked with the Gibson records, their importance was clear to me. What I didn't know, though, was that Poland's own records of these events had been destroyed by the decimation of Warsaw in 1945. What little was left was deliberately lost by the communist government that took over Poland in 1947. When that government fell in 1989, there were few records left to recreate their early history. American in Warsaw provides precisely those records. About the time the manuscript was completed, serendipity showed up again, this time in the form of 2 European scholars, Joachim Bohler from Germany and Jan Roman Potocki from Poland. Both men sought me out, I don't know how they found me, but they did, became entranced with the project and stepped in to help in various ways. So if we fast forward again to September of 2018, more surprises were in store. By some magic, the planned launch of the Polish edition in Warsaw morphed into an event hosted by the U.S. Embassy. Ambassador Georgette Mosbacher presented the book during her first public policy statement in Poland on September 14th. A round of TV and radio interviews followed. TVN 24, the Polish subsidiary of Discovery Channel, aired their presentation of An American in Warsaw on September 29th. As we worked on the book, Jan Roman and I became aware of just how many Americans had stepped up to help Poland. To honor them, an exhibition will open in Warsaw this coming June. Americans in Poland. One of my tasks was to seek out the descendants of some of our heroes. So far, the Gibson family and Margaret Hoover, Herbert's great-granddaughter, are happily on board. In another instance of serendipity, I was able to connect with the family of the U.S. ambassador who had the dubious honor of being in Warsaw during the Nazi Blitzkrieg of 1939, Anthony Drexel Biddle, Jr. Until recently, I had no idea that my favorite childhood movie, The Happiest Millionaire, was a true story. Nor did I realize that the ambassador was the son of that Anthony Drexel Biddle. This past June, I was honored to spend a few days in the home of Karen and Anthony Drexel Biddle III in Maryland. They are in. I hope you enjoyed hearing a bit about Hugh Gibson's story and my own. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Okay, hi. My name is Franca. I read a book about the Yalta talks, and I know that one of the stumbling blocks or one of the key things was the Soviets and the border in Poland, and we had a lot of discussion about Germans and Polish, who was Russian, who was, it was
Confusing.
it was very Stalinistic type of conversation. So you don't mention any of that. Do you have any information that connects to that?
I do, but it relates more to Biddle than it does to Gibson. Biddle resigned his post as ambassador because of that issue and what happened at Yalta. So there's a lot of material there. Arthur Bliss Lane, who was Gibson's assistant in 1919, 1920, later was the U.S. ambassador in 1945. And he resigned in 1947 when it became clear that their democratic elections were not going to happen. So there's a connect, and all these men were connected for the whole time period. So there are definitely connections. I don't know if that answered your question.
How do you explain the enormous disparity between the Western press and Gibson on the treatment of Jews in Poland? And a second, kind of related, did he include the Warsaw Ghetto tragedy in his later writings?
Okay. I'm going to take the second question first. He did not include the Warsaw Ghetto tragedy because it hadn't happened yet. That was 20 years in the future from when Gibson was there. So he would not have, there wasn't a Warsaw Ghetto in 1919, 1924 when Gibson was there. But in terms of the difference in the press, we like to read headlines. We like to read flashy headlines. So there's that issue driving the sales of New York Times and papers like that. There was also the issue of German propaganda and other propaganda that it was in their interest to see the Polish government fall, because then they would get their land back. So there were lots of different issues that created the situation of why reports were different. But it's hard to argue in my mind when you're talking to a person that was listed as deceased by name and you're talking to them. That's pretty strong evidence.
Can you tell us something about the history of Silesia and how it went back and forth between Poland and Germany?
A little bit. That's the area that lies between Poland and Germany and Czechoslovakia, and it's where those critical coal fields are. That it did go back and forth. It started as part of Germany and Austria with those empires, and then was left open for 3 years. And finally, by diplomatic negotiations, ceded to Poland. And that lasted then, of course, until the Blitzkrieg, and then it was German again. So now the whole, and I think now it's Poland again, because I think the whole of Poland moved westward in World War II. So it kind of, those borders have moved a lot. The central part of Poland has been the most constant, but both the east and the west have been fought over by Germany and Russia, basically.
Hi, and to follow up on that, when did the borders actually become stabilized
Sorry.
with Poland and as a country, and how did that come about?
I think that came about, I'm not sure it was Yalta or right after World War II that stabilized, and I believe that they've stayed stable since that time. The government has changed, but the borders have stayed.
This is Bob. Thank you.
Sure.
Learned a great deal this morning, and it was in areas which I did not have information at all. The part that I'm interested in is who was the voice for Poland coming back into existence as a nation state? What I see is a very weak situation from the point of view of Poles having political power. Something, however, gave them some support outside of their own people. And who was the voice for them to the powers that surrounded them?
Probably many voices, but the single one I can point to the most clearly is President Woodrow Wilson, with his 14 points and this idea that Poland should be a nation. That came around about through this Polish National Committee that GIBSON worked with, that had approached President Wilson through Colonel House, one of his aides, and made that need known. And that became part of Wilson's creed then, to create a strong and independent Poland. We didn't get to the strong part, but he was able to help create an independent Poland. And Paderewski and a lot of Poles that were no longer in that area, that had emigrated during that long partition period, were advocating for independent Poland, and they saw their opportunity as the empires fell and the war created that opportunity.
This is Jim. I noticed that you mentioned that your mother and her sister were among those displaced migrants. Do you mind sharing with us her fate, how that went, and what happened?
They have an interesting story. My mom was born in Warsaw in 1930, and was growing up during the Nazi years. Her father was actually of German descent, and her mother was a Pole. It was the first relationship between a Pole and a German in their family. But as the war went on, they had to leave. They couldn't stay in Poland with the Russians coming in. So they actually fled from Warsaw on July 31st of 1944, the day before the Warsaw Uprising began. And pretty much Warsaw was flattened the next day. They were the last train out, and it happened to be going to Vienna, and it took them 7 years in Vienna to get everything in place to make their way to Los Angeles.
I don't know if we have any more questions. We still have a little bit of time. There's a few down there.
When we lived in Chicago, I noticed there was quite a population of Poles, like over 1 million, I think.
Quite a few.
The largest cultural group. And could you tell me when that migration occurred, or?
I don't know exactly. I think it was right around the late 1800s, as during the partition time and the famine, as war was coming. I think more came. Yeah, I would say it was right around the late 1800s, beginning of the turn of the century, because it was the KOSCIUSKO squadron was made up mostly of the sons of those Polish-American families, and the Polish Grey Samaritans were the daughters. And they were both just about that age to offer their services. So I think that timing is about right. The biggest preponderance came, say, 1890, something like that.
This is Lester. I don't know how much you're looking into the current situation, but if you are, I'd like to hear some comments about what is I'm perceiving as a shift to a more autocratic and Catholic-centered government in Poland at this time.
That's a more touchy question. Yes, there has been a shift in the Polish government, and I can't pretend to know a whole lot about it. But I do know there's, interesting ideas on both sides of that question. We stayed with cousins when we were there in September, and one of my cousins was absolutely against this government and thought it was horrible, and the other one had voted for them and thought they were wonderful in making necessary changes. So very similar debates to what we hear. But I have to say, I saw the most beautiful protest I have ever seen in my life. Usually I'm not comfortable with protest and the bullhorns in my face. I don't like that. But this time in downtown Warsaw near the Old Town, there's a tall, beautiful statue of King Zizimund the Great from sometime in the ancient Polish history. But he stands on top of a podium about as tall as this room. And there he stands up there with the cross in one hand and the sword in the other and presides over all of Old Town. One morning I went back there and he was now wearing a white stole with one red word written across the top. And it just said Constitution. No one knew who put it there. No one claimed who put it there, but it took the Polish government 4 days to get it down. So I thought that was pretty eloquent.